In this video, we will be discussing how to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. You will be expected to apply your knowledge moving forward, so please pause and replay the video if needed. Let's just quickly review some things we already know about quadratics. When you're solving a quadratic equation, what you're doing is you're finding what we call the zeros or the solutions. And this is where the graph crosses the x-axis. We've talked about two different ways that we can do this. The first one is solving by factoring, where you set the equation equal to 0, factor the expression, and then you solve for where y is 0, and you figure out what the x values are. And this is what we call solving by factoring. So in this case, x is equal to 2/3 and x is equal to -5. Remember, most quadratic equations have two solutions. That's going to become important later on in the video. Another method we talked about was solving by graphing. So all you do is you graph the quadratic equation and you look for the roots or where that graph crosses the x-axis. So in this case, it crosses at the point -2, 0 and 5, 0. So the equations are x equals -2 and x equals 5. So these are our solutions to that graph. Another thing I want to review because it's extremely important for the quadratic formula is identifying your a, b, and c value. When a quadratic function is written in standard form, the numbers in your equation a, b, and c are the numbers either in front of a variable or the constant. So your a is the coefficient of x squared, your b is the coefficient of the x term in the middle, and the c is your constant at the end. And remember, equations should always be set equal to 0 when solving quadratic functions. The first common mistake I want to talk about is when you're identifying the a, b, and c value, you have to be careful. Remember, we want that equation to be set equal to 0, so we need to pay attention to the signs. In this case, a is 2. This b looks like it's missing, but when there's a no number in front, we know that that value is 1 because this is 1x, and c is -5. You have to make sure you pay attention to that subtraction. In the second example, the thing that becomes tricky is the fact that in this case it's equal to 3, not 0. So when that happens, you have to subtract 3 from both sides before you can identify the a, b, and c value. So here we get x squared plus 4x, and 5 minus 3 is a positive 2. So that's where I got this value of c equals 2 from. So please make sure you identify those when they're equal to 0. The third example I wanted to show you was if your equation is not written in standard form, you might by accident mix up your a, b, and c value. So you always want to rewrite the equation first in standard form, so the x comes before the constant, before you identify your a, b, and c value. So now you can see that a is -1, b is -7, and c is +6. If you don't have it in standard form, it's very easy to mix up a, b, and c. So now we're going to start talking about what the quadratic formula actually is, and it is our third method for solving these functions. So the quadratic function is, the quadratic equation is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now I'm sure that sounds scary, but remember, it's a formula. All we have to do is substitute in and use whatever the formula tells us as our answer. There's a couple things I just want to point out to you when using this formula. The first thing is this -b, we want to read it as the opposite of b. So whatever our b value is, we're going to end up switching it to its opposite here. All right, and remember your a, b, and c value come from your equation. The next thing I want to point out to you is this plus or minus. This is where we're going to get our two solutions from. I'll tell you how to use it in a couple minutes, but just beware that that's how we say that, plus or minus. The last thing I want to point out to you is that this square root is a grouping symbol. So when we use order of operations, we're going to want to use the grouping symbol square root to simplify first. Another common mistake when using the quadratic formula is when you're substituting, you want to make sure that you're using parentheses. So any number you substitute in must go in parentheses. And you also want to make sure that you're paying attention to the sign. It is very important to do that. Remember, this we would read as the opposite of -5 is 5, or the opposite of +5 is -5. Another place where parentheses become really important is when you're using exponents. This would be -5 squared is +25 because -5 times -5 equals +25. This one is read differently. This is read as the opposite of 5 squared. We know that 5 squared is 25, and the opposite of that is -25. Remember, your calculator is your best friend when using the quadratic formula, so please make sure to use it. So now we're going to solve using the quadratic formula. The first thing you want to do is you want to identify your a, b, and c like we already talked about. So the a value for this equation is 1, b is 2, and c is -15. So that can check off my first box here. Then I'm going to rewrite the formula, which I already did. And now I'm ready to substitute a, b, and c. Remember, when you're substituting in, you want to use parentheses. So x equals, this negative stays here because that is not my b. But in parentheses, where I see b, I'm going to want to write the number 2. Plus or minus the square root of b, again, I'm going to put a 2, squared, minus 4 times my a value, which is 1, times c, which is -15. I'm just going to extend that to make sure it's all under that grouping symbol. All divided by 2 times my a value is 1. So please make sure you're very careful when you're substituting in. The first place I'm going to look after I substitute in is I'm going to start with my grouping symbol of my radical. Now this is where you want to use your calculator. You want to make sure that in your calculator you are typing in this entire expression all at once, not in parts. Please don't use mental math here. It's where you're going to make a mistake. So x equals, the opposite of 2 is -2, plus or minus the square root. And in this case, if I were to plug this whole thing into my calculator, I'm going to get 64. Divided by 2 times 1 we know is 2. So that big scary equation just turned into something much more manageable. Now the good thing about this example is when we simplified that, we should notice that the square root of 64 is a perfect square. And we know that when we take the square root of 64, we should get 8. So I'm going to simplify this even further to x equals -2 plus or minus 8 divided by 2. And this plus or minus, this is where it's going to come in. It's going to break our factors up into 2 parts. So I'm going to write it as x equals -2, and I'm just going to use this plus symbol, plus 8 divided by 2. And then I'm going to write my second solution as x equals -2, and now I'm only going to use the minus, 8 divided by 2. And now I'm ready to simplify these two to show what my solutions are. -2 plus 8 is 6 divided by 2, and 6 divided by 2 we know is 3. -2 minus 8 is -10, and -10 divided by 2 is -5. So here this shows me that my two solutions for this quadratic are x equals 3 and x equals -5. Now you will only get nice whole numbers as your solution if this square root here is a perfect square. If it ends up not being a perfect square, then your answers are going to look a lot messier. So I want to show you what that example looks like. So this example is going to end up not having whole number solutions. So you'll notice here that a is 2, b is -10, and c is 3. So I've identified my a, b, and c. Now I already have the equation written down, so I'm ready to substitute into my equation. x equals, remember, this negative always stays there. And then in parentheses, I'm going to substitute in for b, and this is a -10 I'm plugging in. It's okay that we have double negatives here. Don't worry about it yet. Plus or minus the square root. B squared is going to be my -10, make sure it's in parentheses, squared, minus 4 times that 2 in parentheses, times that 3 in parentheses, divided by that whole numerator gets divided by 2, divided by, and in this case, my a value is 2. So again, now we're ready to simplify that radical, okay? So we want to make sure to plug this entire expression in all at once into our calculator, and it should give us one number, and that's what should go underneath the radical. So now I'm going to rewrite this as x equals the opposite of -10 is +10, plus or minus, and when I plugged this into my calculator, I got 76 as my radical, divided by 2 times 2 is 4. So notice how these three pieces I simplified all separately. Now I'm ready to try and figure out what my solutions are. The problem is this time I don't know what the square root of 76 is. So I'm just going to leave it alone for now, but I am going to separate my solutions into two different parts using this plus or minus, just like I did with the other example. So my first solution is going to be x equals 10 plus the square root of 76 divided by 4. And my second solution, I'm only going to use the subtraction, and I get x equals 10 minus the square root of 76 divided by 4. Now, even though these look messy and unfinished, they are our solutions. You can either write them separately, or you could actually leave it using the plus or minus. The two solutions here are implied, so you don't need to separate them, but you can. The other option you might have is if the question asks you to estimate, and only if it asks you to estimate, you may need to find what decimals these are equivalent to. And that's where you're going to want to just plug this into your calculator. So I would plug in 10 plus the square root of 75, or I'm sorry, the square root of 76, and take that and divide it by 4 and see what I get. In this case, if I do it in my calculator, I will get that x, and remember this is an estimate, is about, I'm going to round to the nearest tenth, so 4.7, because it's 4.679, blah, blah, blah. Then I would do the same thing in my calculator, and I would type in 10 minus the square root of 76, and then divide that by 4, and I would get that x is about 0.3 if I were to round to the nearest tenth. Remember, these are both irrational solutions, but I'm rounding them if it asks me to estimate. If it just asks me to solve, I can leave these as my solutions, and in fact, you should leave them like that. Remember, some solutions might end up looking like whole numbers, and some solutions might end up looking more like these irrational, funky answers, and that's okay. So in this video, we discussed how to solve a quadratic equation using a formula called the quadratic formula. You will be expected to apply this knowledge in practice. Don't worry, we will continue to practice this as this takes a lot of practice to get good at. So please replay the video if needed.